All right, well, we are finishing up, excuse me, we're finishing up this series of modules, and I am up here in Steamboat trying to get some writing done, so I thought I'd go ahead and record the last of this series. And I'm here with a steaming cup of coffee and all ready to go to try to bring you up to speed with twins and adoption studies. And really that's what we're talking about here, and the genetic and environmental influences on intelligence. And so the things to keep in mind, let me just put this heading up here so we know what we're doing. Genetic and environmental. Mental influences. One of the things that is particularly of interest to me, since I'm an adopted kid, is this whole idea of twins and adoption studies. And this is one of these places where we get a great deal of information, particularly when it comes to the influences on influences on intelligence, because we can, in some respects, it's not that we can actually vary it, but we can study the variation of growing up in your family of origin, biological family of origin, or growing up somewhere else. And so in that sense, we're able to actually look at the environmental influences versus the genetic influences. And on occasion, twins are separated at birth. And so studies of twins, family members, and adopted children together point to a significant genetic contribution to intelligence scores. So there is a significant genetic contribution to intelligence. And I think in a lot of ways that's not really doesn't come as any surprise to anyone, that the fact is genetics do. The most genetically similar people, as you would expect, have the most similar scores, ranging from 0.85 in a correlation. Now remember how we do a correlation. A trend line like this is 1.0. They're saying plus 0.85, which is really a significant. We're only 15/100ths of a point away from a perfect correlation. Dropping all the way down to 0.33, and that's a third. So, and this 0.33 is actually unrelated people. So there's a significant difference by, if you add the numbers up, by almost 0.5 in terms of genetic contribution to intelligence scores. Now, a key word to keep in mind is a word that we refer to as heritability. And like I've said to you guys before, is that terms are really an effective means of studying this material, partly because they bring with them their definitions. And heritability refers to the extent to which differences among people are attributable to genes. So one way that we oftentimes mark difference is the delta sign, the Greek triangle. So the differences among people is attributable to genes or inheritance. And that's really what's key to understand what influences actually occur to intelligence scores. So to say that heritability of intelligence is 50%, doesn't mean that half of the individual's intelligence is inherited. Rather, what it means is, and so we say 50%, what this actually means is that 50% of the variation, so the changes of the variation differences in intelligence scores between people from one person to another is attributable to genetics. So among those studied, so the 50% is a really quite high percentage if you think about it. I mean, it isn't just random. It's 1 out of every 2. We can say that the difference in intelligence scores is directly related to genetics. So the estimates of heritability of intelligence range from 50 to 80%. In terms of estimates of in this particular area that we're talking about here with genetic influences. Mental similarities between adopted children and their adoptive families ultimately wane with age until the correlation is 0 completely. So I don't think that we're going to say that, excuse me, I'm sorry for clearing my throat in your ear. This element has to do with genetics. Adopted kids start out with some mental similarities with their families, but the longer and more experience they gain, the more it gets to the point where, excuse me, that we get a 0 correlation. So if you remember where 0 was, the scatter points were all over the map here, and they showed no particular pattern. I can certainly attest to that. Being an adopted kid, I grew up in a family where 2 people were high school graduates at best. And my dad fought in World War II and came home and married his high school sweetheart, and they couldn't have kids, so they adopted a child, and that was me. And so in that environment, my mental similarity was probably the highest when I was a kid, but the longer life went on, and obviously the environmental experience is part of that. Also the education is also a part of that influences and begins to take an adopted kid far away, if you will, from the adoptive parent's mental capacities. Now, the other thing, excuse me, my goodness, the other thing to keep in mind is another term, and that is polygenic. And polygenic, that key term means that many genes are involved with intelligence. Many genes. I'm sorry, I made a G instead of a Y. With intelligence. And so, in a sense, they are spread across the person's genetic code, and each gene accounts for less than 1% of the variations in intelligence. The other thing to keep in mind is that we have pinpointed specific genes that seemingly influence the variations that we're looking at in intelligence and in learning disabilities. And the other final comment is that we can't say that environmental influences are not there. So in other words, we can say that with a fair amount of confidence that there's evidence to indicate that environmental influences do have an impact on intelligence. You look at intelligence test scores of fraternal twins raised together are far more similar than those of other siblings, and the scores of identical twins raised apart are less similar than the scores of identical twins raised together. So clearly, we still have a large role to play in intelligence scores when we talk about environmental influences. So as you can tell, we are back to the nature-nurture issue. In the case of intelligence scores, we have it nailed down that genetic contribution can go all the way up to 85%, probably more likely in the people that are identical twins. On the other hand, environmental influences, the longer somebody lives, actually has a greater and greater impact on that individual and how different they look, essentially, to the rest of their family generally.